Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to talk about wet blending, specifically tips for beginners when they're just starting to wet blend. Wet blending was a process that took me a long time to learn, was pretty frustrating. I felt like I got a lot of contradictory information, and so I want to hopefully condense what I've learned as I would say, pretty mediocre painter, and how I've used wet blending to help me speed up my painting, get rudimentary transitions quickly on the model, and allow me to spend more time on my highlights and glazing and things that really make my model pop. First off, let's talk about the consistency of the paint when you are wet blending as a beginner. I would suggest you do not do much thinning of your paint. In fact, if you're using something like P3, you're using Pro acrylic line, even if you're using Games Workshop paints, Seville paints, I would just take it out the bottle and put it on a wet palette, and the only thinning that should occur should be from your wet palette. I'm going to tell you why. Alright, if you thin your paint too much, you basically got one pass when wet blending to make a transition that you like before you have to let it dry. If you go back and fudge with it and mess with it, in my experience, you tear up the paint, you get uneven coverage, and it looks awful, and you really didn't do much. With thick paint, you're able to go back for up to about 5 minutes and add some lowlights, add your highlights, mess with that transition, work the paint back and forth until you get a transition that you're happy with. And most modern paints are so pigment rich that you don't have to worry about seeing the pigment and having what you used to see with the almost look chunky on the model. Unless you are putting ridiculous amounts of paint on your model, you're not going to have to worry about that. I know we've all been taught 2 thin coats, but trust me, for wet blending, until you get comfortable with it, use thicker paint, and then as you're used to working the paint back and forth, you can go thinner and thinner. But really, even after doing this for a while, I still keep my paint quite thick. Now, let's talk about the different brands of paint that are suitable for wet blending. Well, the answer is basically all of them. There are some that are better than others. For example, I think the best paint range for this is the Scale 75 heavy body acrylics. For these, I do water them down a bit because they are very, very thick. Alright, but I basically water them down to about the consistency of P3. They're very creamy, they're very pigment rich. They do a great job of wet blending. Also, P3 is great. The Pro acrylic range I've had great success with. Even Citadel paints, I think, are really good. The 2 that I've had some uneven results with are Vallejo and Scale 75. Some of the paints I feel like are too thin or are not pigment rich enough for me and have some spotty results. But again, I think you'll be able to do fine with those, just with a few of the paints within that line maybe being problematic. Then quickly, let's talk about brushes. I like to use a larger brush than I'd usually paint for detailing. Here I'm using a size 3 Raphael 8404. And if you notice, the edge of this is rounded. It's an older brush. I like to use older brushes that don't have a fine tip on them. I feel like, as you're going to see, the motion that you use for wet blending, this back and forth motion, having the rounded tip helps you kind of smudge the colors together. Also, just by wet blending like this, you will ruin the tip of your nicest paintbrush. So if you have an older brush, I think that is perfect for wet blending. If you're using your brand new one, just know that after you do it, the hairs will kind of not hold as fine as a tip as if you're layering or edge highlighting with it. Finally, let's talk about where you should be wet blending. You should be wet blending on large open areas, especially if they're flat, in which you need a gradient or transition, but you don't have an airbrush, and it would take tens, dozens, hundreds of layers to get a smooth transition. That's where wet blending shines. You really don't want to be wet blending in small, contained areas with lots of detail. It's better just to stick with layering with that. It's hard to really mix the colors together when you got a lot of detail in the way. So let's go ahead and start painting this Crimson Crocodile from the Gambler's Chest. Just came out for Kingdom Death. We're going to be here doing a little wet blending on this flank of the monster here. And so I'm actually going to do what I think is a pretty difficult blend. I'm going to take a very dark red, brick red mixed with some purple. and I'm going to mix it into this grayish blue to get a transition from this dark red to, this lighter bluish color. This is a hard transition, going from a warm color to a cool color. If you're working within cool colors or even within the same color, going from like a dark blue to a light blue, you can wet blend this in a minute or two, get a great result, and move on. This is going to be a little bit more complex, but I'm doing it to show you that even with colors that don't always mix well together, you can wet blend them into a decent result. So as you see, I like to start with my low light, my darker color, and work down into my higher color. So I first put down the red there, and then I'm taking my brush, I'm not dipping it in water. That was something that took me a long time to learn. I'd dip it in water, go back, and I'd have too much water on my brush, and it would just water down the paint too much. So I'm just taking the brush, I'm wiping it on a paper towel, and I'm going straight into my highlight color, this light blue, and I'm starting right up where I left off with a dark red, and I'm working it back and forth down towards the bottom of the model where I want it to be this light blue. Now for this model, I want a very short transition from that red color into my grayish blue, which is going to mean I'm going to have to mess with it more. As you can see, I'm adding more and more of my light color. I'm really not touching much of the shadow color anymore. I'm trying to bring up that transition, make that whole section lighter, because I just want to be like a hint, like that those are like fingers on its back, that the skin tone of the fingers are kind of leaching into the bluish skin of the monster. So I want it to be nice, short, and subtle transition. But as you can see, I've only been going for a few minutes, and you can already see at the top, you got the red, then starts transitioning into a lighter red, then almost into a purplish gray tone, and then at the bottom, it's getting close to that higher gray-blue highlights. And so again, I'll keep working it. You'd be surprised how long you can work with these colors before they start drying and you have to worry about ripping up your paint. It really does last quite a while, and I'm not using Flow Aid. I'm not using anything like that. And already, I think I'm getting a pretty decent transition. And now, one of the reasons why I think this is so vital for beginner painters is most beginner painters do not have access to an airbrush. Honestly, if I wasn't doing this video, I would airbrush this entire thing. With an airbrush, I can get these transitions that will take me probably 10 or 15 minutes in a minute or two, and I'll be able to get them all across the model. Airbrushes really are amazing tools, but again, a lot of people do not have access to them when they first start. They're a big money investment, time investment to learn how to get the correct consistency with the paint, how to work and clean their airbrush. It's kind of a lot. So wet blending can be used to really get quick color blocking in with subtle transitions, or even rudimentary transitions, instead of having to do layer after layer after layer, especially on larger models. Might take you hours to just get your base layer with a decent transition in there. Now that we've been working this paint for a few minutes, I am going to let it dry. I do like to do multiple layers of a wet blend. I think it helps getting a more seamless and subtle blend. So as that is drying, I'm going to show you how easy it is to blend within the same color, going from a higher highlight of a color to a darker tone of that color. So I'm going to take some dark blue-gray and then wet blend it into that lighter Arctic blue, I believe is what it is, from the Artist acrylic range from scale 75. And I'll pretty much just have to do one pass and get a pretty good transition. So here we go. I'm putting that blue, dark blue color down at the bottom section of the crocodile. I'm going to take my Arctic blue, put that right where the two colors meet, where the kind of seam of the colors is. And I'm just going to start working the paintbrush back and forth, mixing those two colors, getting a nice mid-tone there down onto the bottom of the model between that, again, the dark blue and the light. And you'll see how quickly with the same color, how seamless you can get a decent transition, and oftentimes only have to do one coat. And again, the big thing with wet blending is if the transition's not perfect, that's okay. That's okay. You can use layers, washes, glazes to perfect it. As long as you get some variation between your highlight and low light, and you start seeing on the model where you need to put your highlights, or maybe deep in the shadows, you've done what you needed to do with wet blending. This is the first step on the model. It's not the final step. Oftentimes won't look very good to you until, again, you start doing later steps of edge highlighting or use some glazes to help soften some transitions. Again, wet blending should just be used as a way to just start working your transitions into your model. Now that the paint has dried at the top of the model here, we are going to do one more pass of wet blending over our previous layer, and that'll help reinforce the transition. Again, already you can see I do have several tones going from that light blue all the way up to that dark red. I think it's almost where I want it to be, and it will put me in a great position when I start putting on some layers, putting in some glazes, deepening the shadows, especially along those ridges that you can kind of see along the model there in the middle. I think it will look really nice. And you can also tell, like, again, even here, I think the transitions are pretty decent, but they're not perfect. Don't get discouraged that they're not perfect. I used to watch professional painters, especially on like Twitch, that would be speed painting models, and they would use loaded brush technique to brush blending and get perfect results after one pass. Even doing like non-metallic metal, just boom, knock out a sword with one wet blend. And I would try that on my own models, and they would look like trash, and it would just totally set me off from trying wet blending. Again, for us mortals down here that aren't winning golden demons, that should not be what we use wet blending for. It is simply the first step in a long process of getting a model from your bench to the gaming table. Now I'm just going to put some highlights on this model so you can kind of see what the finished result will look like, to show you what kind of techniques you'll combine with wet blending to get a finished result. I'm going to go pretty quick here because I know I'm going to actually be painting over this model. I ended up a little more blue than I was wanting it. I wanted it to read more of like a grayish white tone, and it just reads completely blue. That, and I am going to be airbrushing the rest of the model, and I am not that careful, so I'm sure I'm going to be spraying all over this area, so it's going to be ruined. So I'm just going to do a quick and dirty job here, but show you what you can combine wet blending with. So here, I'm just doing layers. I am mixing some off-white into my light blue-gray mixture, and I'm hitting the middle of the model where you kind of see those ridges sticking up that are likely catching light. And we're just going to put some layers. I'm going to keep working in more of that yellow color until I get almost up to the pure off-white. Here I am now also highlighting the fingers on the ridges of the crocodile, just mixing some pink flesh into this dark purplish red to get some highlights, adding more and more of that off-white into it to highlight the fingers. And now I'm going to start glazing a little bit now that I have my layers in. I'm going to start with my dark red crimson color, just adding, watering it down to be only a filter, to be very translucent. Just adding a layer there, running along those ridges there that I've highlighted. Just get the impression again that this dark flesh color is kind of seeping down into the lighter underbelly skin tones. I do think up at the top here was some of the weaker transitions between the two colors, and so this glaze also helps just reinforce that shadow down there. So apparently I forgot to hit record here for this last bit of footage, but basically all I did is I put in some blue glazes in between those ridges on his skin to get some more lowlights there. Added some more white into my blue mixture for the highest highlights, and just also highlighted the fingers a little bit more. And so you can see, you can still see the transition kind of in between there, but we've covered up most of the wet blending. Again, the wet blending just served as a basis for all these additional layers that we put upon the model. And even though the transition wasn't perfect from our wet blending, I think we were able to get a pretty good result in about an hour's worth of work. So again, wet blending is a great tool. It's a great way to really block in your color to put a nice base foundation down on your color and then improve upon it with glazes and layering. Anyway, hopefully you now have a better sense of wet blending, especially if you are a new painter. I hope you are able to use it in your miniature painting to greater effect, and especially help you get models on the table just a little bit quicker. Anyways, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you all soon with a new video. Take care.